Hello, everyone. I'm John Lynn, the founder and chief editor at Healthcare IT Today. And today we have a really juicy topic, genomic medicine. It's a complex one, but an important one. And for me, it's even more exciting because it's talking about genomics finally being integrated with the EHR. And we have three special guests with us today. First, we have Hoda Sayed-Friel. She's the executive vice president at MEDITECH. Welcome, Hoda. And Dr. William Dailey, he's CMIO at Golden Valley Memorial Hospital, and Jennifer Ford, product manager of genomics at MEDITECH. Welcome to all of you.
Thanks, John, and thanks for the invitation. We're excited to be here.
Always great to talk to you, John.
And definitely, I think we're going to have some interesting perspectives, in this challenging topic. But before we dive into that, Hoda, will you tell us a little bit about yourself and MEDITECH?
Sure. I've been at MEDITECH for 34 years with a variety of different positions. This latest position, I've been in charge of strategy and product development. I'm working with Jennifer and a whole team of folks, specifically on raising the clinical sophistication of our products and introducing things like genomics into the field and into integration with the EHR.
Excellent. And Dr. Dailey, can you tell us about yourself and Golden Valley Memorial Hospital?
Yes, I'm a family physician at Golden Valley Memorial Healthcare. I'm primarily clinical in a small, we're a 55-bed community hospital, and in our setting, you have to wear a lot of hats because there's only so many people to go around. So I do a lot of clinical informatics, and I interface with both the physicians, IT, and administration. And I'm always excited for new approaches to EMR and providing new kind of technology to level the playing field between community hospitals and, let's say, tertiary care centers and things like that.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear how a community hospital can get into genomics. That's pretty rare. So I think that's awesome. And Jennifer, can you share a little bit about your role at MEDITECH?
Sure. So I am the product manager of genomics. I've been with MEDITECH a little over 10 years, and I've been working with Hoda for a number of years to really figure out the best way to incorporate genomics into the EHR in the short term and the long term, and manage everything that's coming along with that for our hospitals.
Yeah, it's an amazing topic. It's one that I love because I think there's so much promise there. But the question, has always been, how do we integrate this with the EHR? How do we integrate that into clinical flow? So Hoda, maybe you could start us off. What was the problem that MEDITECH was really trying to solve by adding genomic applications, and genomics to your product? And then maybe Jennifer can chime in as well.
Sure. There were a couple of problems actually that we're trying to solve. Number one, we saw that genomic information was kind of scattered all over the place. It was in academic medical centers and large databases and research databases and 23andMe and all over the place in individual labs and maybe in some of the reference labs. And getting that information to the clinicians was very difficult. And when it did come in for the clinicians, it came in the form of these large, lengthy reports that were hard to read, hard to understand, and actually hard to use for clinical decision support. So we wanted to solve that particular problem. The next problem that we saw was that a lot of our community hospitals don't have geneticists on staff. And the people that were most familiar with genetics were often the oncologists. So trying to have them keep up with all the literature and all the changes and helping them make decisions was difficult for primary care physicians or even other physicians that were trying to treat a patient and offer precision medicine to their patients. We also saw that in a lot of areas, especially in rural and other community settings, genetic testing wasn't readily available. So a lot of our hospitals had to send their patients to academic medical centers. And so they lost the continuity of care because some of their data was in the academic medical center and some of it was in the EHR as part of the community hospital. So they lost that continuity of care. And that also created a situation where there are healthcare inequities. So if you're in, some of these smaller communities and wanting to get to precision medicine, you didn't have access to it as readily. and needed to, you know, either drive far away or whatever. And when you did do it, it wasn't integrated, as I talked about before. So, and then, you know, as part of this effort, we wanted to grab this data and store it in a way that we could use it for clinical decision support at the point of decision making. And that was our fundamental review of what we needed to do in that space.
Yeah, a large PDF file doesn't help with clinical decision support, I imagine,
Correct.
which is probably the way people had done it before. Anything you'd add, Jennifer?
Yeah, I would say just getting a little bit deeper into that, getting interoperability and being able to store these genetic markers in the EHR in a way that is flexible enough to capture all of the differences needed for each specific genetic and gene type or region of interest, but really to get each of those pieces stored in a way that we can then utilize it and serve it up for clinical decision support and make it easily accessible for the physicians in the chart.
Yeah. Dr. Dailey, what's been your response to the release of this genomics application by MEDITECH?
Well, I think I have been pleasantly surprised by the effort here from our EHR vendor and partners that we utilize. You know, as they often say, the future's here. It's just not very evenly distributed. And you know, in a community setting, we've, you know, kind of made it a habit now of kind of having our vendor do some of the heavy lifting for us so that we can optimize what we do in our community setting. You know, we, as Hoda said, we don't have geneticists on staff. We do use genetics to some limited bit in oncology, obviously with somatic genetics and some of the other things that our oncologists do, selection of medications. And of course, they're doing a lot of targeted therapies in oncology now, as well as selection of medications based on that. And I certainly would like to see it transition to where, you know, at the point of care, doing primary care, we can make better decisions, decrease side effects of medications, for instance, practice select medications more appropriately. And I see it as a I guess a spectrum of things. You know, if you're at a Mayo or University of Chicago, they've been testing these things for, you know, 10, 15 years and trying to translate what they're learning into clinically relevant approaches. What this will give us the opportunity to do, and it's just like anything in modern medicine today, you know, whether it be analytics or whatever. You know, before I used to do all the analytics. Well, that gets pretty challenging, and you get all your eggs in one basket. Not every hospital has a guy that can do that. And it's been very wonderful to be able to have a synergistic relationship with MEDITECH, FDB, things like that, that can start putting things together in a way that translate to the bedside or to the patient room, you know, to get the right information, the right person, and the right point in their workflow so that we can make good decisions to treat patients. And so I'm very excited. Certainly there will be challenges in education and in translating the information, but you got to have the information before you can utilize it. And that's what really excites me about it. I mean, I'm very excited. I know we're going to be an early adopter here of this technology that MEDITECH's putting forth. And I know our lab drove that motion, you know, put that in motion. Certainly oncology was part of that. But boy, our pharmacy's really excited about it. To do a little better job at prescribing medications for our patient population. Basically, you know, we say we treat an individual, right? Well, all the medications that we use are based on studies of populations, and populations are not what I treat. I treat people, and it's going to. I'm very excited at how that's going to amplify our ability to take care of those people in the way that they need to be taken care of.
Yeah, and in addition to that, even for our larger facilities that we have that are doing their own genomic testing, we tried to create this platform to bring all of that data together, that we could bring the germline data and the somatic data together and represent it collectively in the chart. So along with dealing with community hospitals that aren't doing that testing, we're also dealing with larger facilities that are doing that testing, which still have data sort of scattered in different systems and so forth. So we're trying to bring that together as well.
Well, and what I have seen as I've watched how this is being put together, and this is what excited me. I'm always looking for a way to put it all into one, sentence. And what I think this is going to allow us to do, and I wrote it down here because I was kind of excited about it, but it'll give us a genetic medical history that will build from time to time, over time for each patient, as we start incorporating this testing. Now, we will do some limited testing locally, and we do, but most of ours will be through a reference lab and then interfaced. But you've got to have the infrastructure there to even interface that. Otherwise, as Hoda said, we get PDFs or whatever. That's not useful. It doesn't break it down. It's not actionable. It doesn't tell me what this means. Because if I just get a bunch of SIP whatevers, coming in, and it's a whole list of things, that's not going to be helpful. I need that to be translated from, what's the marker? What does that mean? And I don't need it all the time. I only need it when I'm going to be treating something that's relevant to that marker. And that's what they're setting forth here for us.
And Jennifer, is that the advantage of integrating it with the EHR, is really pushing it to the point of care? Or do you see other advantages that, having it there with the EHR data provides more advantages than, obviously just having the PDF?
They've discovered, as we continue to dig into genetics more, that genetics and the patient's genetics are such an integral part of care. It's not the only piece of care for a patient that's important, but every decision in many different specialties, we do need to take a look at the patient's genetics. So having that parsed out alongside the rest of the patient data is what's really key about this, and not having to go search and find it, or as a clinician who's at the point of care, not realizing that the data is even out there to utilize it in decision making. That's where the problems really come into play.
And how are you surfacing that, Hoda? I mean, I think you guys have a partnership that you're working with to kind of do the clinical decision support with the genomics as well. I mean, are these alerts? Are these pop-ups? How are you kind of getting it to the doctor?
Yeah, so we have sort of several levels of that we use for clinical decision support. So if we focused in on, for example, the pharmacogenomics piece of it. So we worked heavily in a partnership with First Data Bank, where they created for us their library of medication and marker pairs. So which markers actually affect the metabolization of a particular medication, or a reaction or a sensitivity reaction to a particular medication. So they created that infrastructure for us. So at the point of ordering, at the point of care, at the point of ordering, if the patient has that marker on file and we've done that testing, then we'll do the check and say, hey, you either need to prescribe a different medication, alter the dosage of this medication based on how they metabolize that particular drug. If they haven't done and don't have that marker on file, we'll even suggest you might want to consider doing this testing before you proceed with ordering this particular medication for this patient. So we have it on a variety of different ways. So our EHR works in a way where we've structured that data in a point where we can look for it if someone is prescribing a particular medication, and then take the appropriate action or clinical decision support to let the physician know what they should do next.
And notoriously, I'm anti-pop-up. And luckily that pairs well with MEDITECH, because they don't do pop-ups in the traditional sense. What they have is a little notification, and then you can choose, before you even prescribe a medication, there may be, let's say I'm looking at a list of medications. I have maybe a little asterisk next to one of them, and then I can choose to say, hey, what's that genetic information, or what's that med interaction or whatever, before I even prescribe the medication. And so maybe I can choose a different medication before I even choose one. My pet peeve with EHRs in general is They wait to the tail end to tell you that there's a potential problem. Whereas here, I can be told on the front end, hey, you know, this allopurinol may not be the best medicine here. You may want to pick something else because of the renal function issue or a genetic issue or an interaction. And I like that because it saves me from going all the way through prescribing to figure out that, no, this isn't the right medication. And so pop-ups definitely are not the thing that they used to be in the early 90s and the internet. And they're just as irritating now and distracting as they ever were. So I think they've really gotten it right on how to notify you. And you know, if you don't even want to look at it, you don't look at that. You know, if that's not part of the deal. But I think once physicians get a feel for how much assistance can be there to more appropriately treat, you know, responders to a particular medicine versus non-responders, I think it's going to take off in a major way. And I do think like Mayo does that now proactively and things, and we want to be right up there. You know, I always used to joke Mayo uses the same books we use, but they apply some of that book knowledge a little bit differently because they have different things at their disposal, and we want those also.
Yeah. It reminds me of early days of clinical decision support where I heard a doctor talking about, hey, this educated me on what I needed to do, you know, when it was a condition that wasn't a common one. And, you know, and so the clinical decision support was a great education tool. It feels like this genomics is going to be similar in that many doctors don't realize that, you know, there was a new pharmacogenomics study that could treat some condition, and that's going to be used. So I think that's really interesting. How else do you think that this will impact the patient treatment and even healthcare costs? Any thoughts there, Hoda or Jennifer?
Yeah, I think we can talk about a couple of those, and I'll have Jennifer jump in a second too. So a couple of things. We've also integrated the tumor genomics with this. So imagine you're linking our germline lab results, for example, along with the somatic results that we're finding in pathology, linking all of those to, you know, paint a picture of the genetic picture of the patient, and then also serving up the NCCN guidelines for, you know, their treatment of their particular tumor. So it allows, you know, that clinical decision support to extend into oncology as well, serving up the right types of treatment plans for the oncologist. So that's kind of on the tumor side of the equation. The other thing that we've done to sort of facilitate that for those facilities that don't do their own testing is we actually brought in data from the reference labs in codified HL7 formatted data. So we get, you know, the marker, we get the phenotype, the allele, the interpretation of that, as well as the report. So we can bring that in and, you know, do all of the things that we just spoke about. So if you think about taking that data that we're getting either, you know, from our internal lab or from an external reference lab and applying it to pharmacogenomics, some of the things that you can save are with regards to how efficacious is this treatment going to be for this patient. So, you know, it's a common example, but it's a real one where, you know, there's a lot of Medicare patients that get angioplasties and cardiac stents. A good portion of them, about, you know, anywhere from, you know, 12 to 15% of them don't metabolize the anticoagulant that's used for part of that process. So if you think about all of those patients and all the ones that won't actually metabolize that drug and could potentially get a clot and have a stroke anyway, or won't get the outcome that they're looking for, it seems like Medicare is paying for a lot of treatment for something that's not going to actually get them the outcomes that they're paying for. So, you know, you can extrapolate all of these numbers, but these are real numbers. 30% of the population does not metabolize, you know, the Plavix correctly. You know, so extend that into those areas. A good portion of a population is overly sensitive to HIV medications, and not just sensitive, it can actually kill them if we don't have the genetic testing for their HLA-B markers, for example. Even a common drug like to treat gout, like allopurinol, as Dr. Dailey mentioned, it can cause severe reactions, you know, skin reactions that can be deadly as well. So there's a lot of cost savings that can be made, but more importantly from our end, as people in the clinical environment, getting the outcomes, the proper outcomes and the right outcomes is really what we're after. And a lot of times getting the right outcomes saves money.
Anything you'd add, Jennifer, or other ways you see, these users being able to access this information and improve patient care?
When we sat down to do this, we really took a look at genomics as an area that covers every specialty in healthcare right now. So there's all of this genetic testing that patients are getting throughout their lifetime: newborn screening, carrier screening, predispositional screening, and of course pharmacogenomic and tumor screening that aren't always thought of as top of mind because they are consistently ordered, but the physicians don't have access to the data to take a look at it, right? And so now that we've created an area that can, first thing, consume and structure all of that data, but also display all of that in one easy location for the physicians where they don't have to go looking around, physicians in every setting are going to have so much more access to the data about the patient that these ways to treat our patients it's gonna allow it to morph throughout the entire continuum of care. So that was really our goal, was to take all of this testing and be able to manage it and then take it a step further and work it right into the clinician's workflow, as Dr. Dailey was talking about, and make it simple and easy to understand.
It's interesting you talk about that. I mean, because genomics is such a huge thing, right? I mean, there's so many aspects to it. Are there areas that you're not doing? I mean, I think it was interesting. Hoda mentioned kind of the difference between the direct to consumer genomic testing versus other, full genome sequencing, et cetera. How are you approaching those different things? And are there areas where you're like, hey, we are not getting into that yet, right? Is there any of that? Go ahead, Hoda or Jennifer.
Yeah, so we're not really concerned with the ancestry side of genomics. We're actually looking at, those genetic markers that are deal with healthcare and treatment in health versus ancestry, although there is a correlation between those things. So we haven't really delved very long and hard in trying to make those correlations just yet, but that will be coming down the road. We're even venturing into genomics of bacteria, so we can determine, the strain of E. coli, where did it come from, and we can sort of determine and help figure out what populations were at risk of, getting some severe, intestinal distress because of this particular variant and tracing it back. The same thing with, if you look at COVID-19, when we're tracking variants, that's genomics right there. So the amount of genetic testing and genetic information that's even going to come out of all the testing that we're doing with COVID-19 is just going to explode in this particular area. So the thing that we're going to creep on slowly is predisposition to disease, because there are a lot of ethical things associated with that. So part of our next round of work, and I'll have Jen talk about this, is looking at familial tracking and pedigree charts and so forth. But we have to be prepared to provide other parts of a system that help genetic counselors deal with predisposition of disease. So it's a little bit more controversial in that area. So we really wanted to do a good job in sort of the pure healthcare treatment side of it and the clinical treatment side. And then we would move into those other areas that are a little softer and actually require a lot of deep thought. And Jen, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good point, Hoda. The foundation that we have built is flexible enough to handle all of these results today in time, right? And we can manage getting in these results and bringing them to the clinician. But there's things that we want to do on actually helping guide the clinician that we want to be very careful with, take thought on how we do it. We are planning on building familial tracking and those linkings, which we know is very important, especially in the oncology case, knowing who has those specific germline mutations. And we can break those out now with our structures from those somatic mutations or those mutations that develop in the tumor later, so that the clinicians can see, all right, this is a hereditary mutation, but this one actually developed later on in the tumor, and that's really important for their understanding. But bringing that familial linking and tracking in will help our oncologists understand where those connections are, and that goes into those pedigree charts and everything else that's needed for that.
It makes sense that you want to be careful with that, although it might give me a reason to visit the patient portal finally to, see the risk, right? Use it for some motivation to change my behaviors. I'm going to be a diabetic soon.
We're actually waiting for that research to see if it actually does change behavior. Right now, the early research doesn't actually do that. So, and then you don't want to scare patients either. So it's something for later. I think even patients are learning a little bit more about that when they're sending out their genomic testing and kind of understanding it a little bit more. So everyone will catch up in that particular area, but we have to tread lightly because we don't want to intimidate anyone because it's not all of those things are definites. There's a lot of how you grew up and, are you drinking water with too much lead? Or there's a lot of sort of what's happening around you that has an effect on whether these things actually show up or not.
Yeah. And that's why genetic counselors are becoming so popular.
Correct.
Which is
Correct.
interesting. Dr. Dailey, anything you'd add to these? Or, I think it's also interesting that, it's hard to keep up with everything that's happening with genetics. Like there's so much investment, so much discovery, how are you going to rely on this application? Or, is it it's interesting, clinical decision support previously, was a lot of like, hey, Dr. Dailey, put in whatever support you wanted. And then it kind of evolved to a best practices. I mean, how do you think genomics is going to play out in this regard?
Well, I'm kind of a medical futurist when it comes to technology. I consider this no different than medical interactions built into the EMR through a vendor or whatever, as opposed to using a physician's desk reference. I haven't even seen one of those for years. They've made really good paperweights and bookends and things like that. We used to use that.
Yeah.
And then we got into other applications that are on your Palm Pilot. I've kind of gone through
Hippocrates took that market
spectrum there to my iPhone to built into the EMR, and that's a big change. And then you've got to decide, okay, how often do you want to see this information? Do you really want to see this information? What information do you want to see? You need some help paring that down. But once you get that right, and you need the EHR to get that right. You need your vendor and their partners to get that right. Once they get that right, that's gospel. It's just like our standard order sets and things like that for pneumonia or any of that stuff. I think there was some resistance initially. I don't want somebody telling me how to do it. I don't want the pharmacist telling me how to do what I'm doing. And then they realized we could do better care. We could provide better care for our patients, shorter lengths of stay, better outcomes, based on following standard protocols or following standard, minding med interactions, things like that. So where I really see this going, at least in my dreamy world of ideal technology, is we're in a tricky place with genomics, right? We've all kind of talked about that already. I'm sure 23andMe, and I know I've watched the reports over the years since their inception, have gotten a lot of flack over providing predisposition data that wasn't approved by the FDA, et cetera. And now they're getting more and more, and they're gradually rolling it out. And it ended up working in their favor because now they can do a 23andMe plus to give you more disposition data as they get them approved. My ideal world sees this a blend of consumerism and medicine in the long run, because I think you should be able to control who sees what is in your genome. And I don't think there's anything wrong with you owning your genome. I don't think the insurance company should have access to your genome, for instance. I remember in medical school, we talked about these ethical issues because they're going to be coming while they're here.
Yeah.
But I would love to have on the clinical side a way to extract the things that, while 23andMe can't give them to a patient, if we can extract those things out of their genome and say, okay, now I'm a doctor. I know what the data says, and I'm allowed to tell you what this data means. but I got to have it in front of me. And until I have it in front of me, I can't do that. And I'm not going to go through their 23andMe and try to explain it, because you need specific things. It's like when I have 23andMe and Ancestry, because I needed to know what people were saying, and it's interesting to me. But it, you know, very little of that, what they do for sequencing, is really relevant clinically. Some of it is, you know, if they'd pull out a BRCA, you know, on every female that or male that got, and I'm sure they can, I'm sure they do, I'm sure they've got all kinds of that. If they could do that and we could extract that and put it right into their genetic history because they got $100 gene sequence, well, you know, that's got some value. You know, there may be a day when we say, hey, I want this patient's genetic history. The patient says, okay, here's my 23andMe, pull it all in. And then Jennifer and Hoda have created a tool by which I don't even have to order a lab. Yeah. They've got it all. It's just 23andMe is not allowed to distribute that. Will that cost us a couple $100 to get it from 23andMe? Maybe that's the way it'll be monetized. But at the end of the day, it'll be between the patient and I, not between the patient, the insurance company, their employer, the government, and all this other things. And so I do think that's an important part of this, because there is certain sanctity between a patient and their doctor that doesn't exist between the patient and their government or the patient and their insurer. And I do think that's going to enable us to do some things. But if you don't, you know, I've dug into the ontology of genomics, and it's a real mess. I don't know how you've even done it, guys, because there's about 4 standards out there. You know, it's like what they say about standards. Everybody has one, you know, and they're all different. I think to lay the foundation for this is huge. The way I see these things built is they're built intuitively enough that the information's there when you want it, if you want it. And then you work your way through. It's like an iPad, right? You didn't teach your kid how to use an iPad. Your kid picked it up and went, oh, I can use this. And, you know, you're like, whoa, you're 4. You know, it took me a little bit with an iPad. But if you don't ever have it in front of them, they'll never use it. And so I'm excited by the fact that they're figuring out a way to bring this in, put it in a position where it can be actionable, where I need to use it. And when the day comes when all of this, you know, pre-checking for G6PD and SIP, whatever comes up, and it's truly relevant, and we need to be checking it, and it's paid for, you know, there's a whole infrastructure. What you incent occurs, right? And so if there's not a payment infrastructure, that's going to be a problem. But I think there's no doubt in my mind, this is going to go to the point where we darn well better be checking for genetic things, see if they're responders or non-responders, because you can treat depression for a long time with SSRIs and find out that was never going to work. You know, how many statins do I got to go through and make people ache for months for some no apparent reason before I figure out, well, statins are not a good idea? How many times are insurance companies going to continue to pay for that, despite the fact that I could have known a year ago that wasn't going to fly? And then, you know, and it just goes on and on and on. I mean, I think that there's a limitlessness to genomic data that goes even into epigenomics and, you know, methylation and things like that I think we're just scratching the surface, and it's complicated already. Absolutely. But it's exciting. And if you don't have a way to put it in front of a doctor at the point of care, it's got no purpose.
Yeah, I can't wait to see the tweet from you that said the genomic data in my EHR saved this patient's life. I can see it, right? Like, and I know you'll tweet it. So
yeah, well, and you know, breast cancer is an ideal example of where we've fallen short. You know, and I'm talking about we as medicine as a whole in the United States and worldwide. You know, tamoxifan's a great medicine, and it's preventive for breast cancer in some people. The people that have BRCA and have a certain mutation and don't have this other mutation, that's the challenge, right? So you got to know who your patient population is, who it will really help, because right now you can't use tamoxifen to prevent breast cancer because you have to treat 50 patients to prevent 1 breast cancer. And many of those patients, you're giving it to them for absolutely no reason. And it's not going to help a thing because they're not going to respond to it. Right. So I think the future is bright for genomics. We just have to wait for it to translate, but you can't get any translation to real care unless you have the information at your fingertips.
Absolutely. Hoda, any final thoughts?
Yeah, and I'll pick up one point from Dr. Dailey. One of the things that we are exploring with all of the different large databases that have genetic information beyond the reference labs is actually creating, maybe through Commonwealth or through some other interoperability with the right authorization, mind you, for treatment. To ping those databases to just get a piece of what I'm looking for the type of treatment or the type of test that I'm doing at that particular point. So, EHRs aren't going to be in the business of storing, the terabytes of someone's whole gene sequencing, or even the exome sequencing. There's just too much there, but we'd like to be able to know where that information exists and tap and go look for it. So part of some of the work that I do with Commonwealth, the Interoperability Alliance, is sort of trying to figure out how do we deal with sort of the explosion of this information and how do we kind of make it a little bit more liquid and rather than being trapped in these siloed databases. So that's a future effort. There's a lot behind what needs to happen in order for that to work, but it's definitely something that I'm waving a flag on, based on the work that we're doing here. I think, with the product that we've created, we've done sort of the hard part, which is building that infrastructure. And I have to give Jennifer and the team that she worked with to sort of create a structure that was going to be that expansible and extendable to help us deal down the road with any variation of these genes, of these markers, of all of the things that are coming forward. So we're only at the tipping point of everything, but we've already just made some significant process in just digesting this major effort and making it more tangible and more accessible and within the reach of all of our customers, big, small, medium. Jen, do you want to add?
Yeah, so I think to that too, we talk about big, small, medium, but we worked across the world with customers internationally, here in the US and everywhere else to develop a structure that was going to be able to stand the test of time and gather this data and also not break those storage barriers that we had a huge concerns about. How were you going to store all this data? Well, it's structured in a way now to pull out the important parts so that that's no longer a problem. And then bring it right to the clinicians with that decision support that Dr. Dailey was talking about, without them having to do groundwork on their side to try and build in interactions and that sort of thing. All of that's all taken care of in the background. And that's really what's going to make the difference of being able to manage this data in the long run.
And I think when you say data, I think it is really important to understand the transition from data to information to knowledge to action.
Yeah.
And at any one point you could mess that up. You got to have the data. You got to create knowledge or information from that data in a way that's readable. Then you create the knowledge point, and then you take action on that with a patient face to face. And I think that's a critical transition that we sometimes overlook. I saw that with some of the my criticality of artificial intelligence, right? So we've already got a lot of data. So now we're going to create more data using artificial intelligence to some extent, and then we're going to have more data we don't use. So you've got to make sure you have a clear path from data to action, at least on the clinical side, because if you don't have a clear path, then you're creating data for the sake of creating data, and we need to be able to use that data. And I do definitely see that path with what MEDITECH's getting done here with Jennifer. And my hat's off to you if I had a hat.
That's excellent. Well, I appreciate all of you sharing these insights and perspectives. I think genomics is such an exciting area. There's so much happening that can really impact patients. And so it's great to see the start of it getting pushed to the point of care through the EHR. So thank you so much to all of you. And thanks everyone for watching. If you want to find more great healthcare IT content like this, be sure to check it out at healthcareittoday.com. Thanks everyone.
Thank you, John.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Have a great day.